the evidence is they do. So some of the reduction in violence is apparent and not real. But in any case, the main reason for the troop escalation was to produce political compromise, and that hasn't worked at all. In fact, since the troop escalation began last March, the Iraqi government has increasingly collapsed. Two major factions of Shiites withdrew from al-Maliki's government, then the Sunni Arabs withdrew, and then the secular Shiites withdrew. So, the idea was he would have some Sunni Arabs with him in his parliament and in his cabinet, and then he would reach out to the rest of the Sunni Arabs when things were calmer. Instead, he's lost the Sunni Arabs that he had with him, and there's no evidence that he's brought any significant numbers into the government. So, there's an over-concentration in the American press on the reduction in casualties, as if that's the only important datum to come out of Iran. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Well,
I was surprised during your presentation, just like the press or the government briefings, the word collaborator was missing. If you look at the situation in Iraq, there is an overwhelmingly powerful foreign occupation. And the local Iraqis with pride or who love their country, who oppose the occupation, the only thing they can do is to kill each other. That's the only way of getting rid of the occupation, because they're going to cut the supply lines, they're going to kill the police force, or whoever accepts green American dollars from the foreign occupiers. Of course, they're going to be seeing them as collaborators. Isn't that true that there are two different pictures? One, struggle or killing and fighting violence, increased violence under occupation, and when the occupation leaves, it will be a totally different picture. Would you agree?
Well, I agree that that is an accurate description of how the guerrillas would look at it. I try to avoid words like collaborator or resistance or whatever, because I think they're emotionally charged. I'm trying to, as far as I can, give a social science accounting of what's going on. But what you said is certainly how the guerrilla movement would view the situation.
Dr. Cole, thank you for a wonderful talk. Are there any Shiite parties in Iraq that actually want an independent Iraq? They don't want Iran meddling. They don't want to be a part of Iran or an extended Iran. Yes, they want to be Shiite, but they want to be a separate country. Can you talk about that?
Okay, so I don't think there are any Shiite parties in Iraq that want to be an appendage of Iran. I would turn it around. The Supreme Council has a strong alliance with Tehran, but it's not a puppet. And if it were a puppet, it wouldn't be going and having barbecues with George Bush in the White House. But the Sadr movement is mostly these Shiite working class kids in the slums of the Shiite southern cities, and they mostly don't like Iran very much. They're Iraqi nativists, and Muqtada Sadr is always complaining about Persian influence on Iraqi Shiism and so forth. And then there are people to the right of that movement. There's a man named Sheikh Mahmoud al-Hassani al-Sarki, who leads an offshoot of the Sadr movement that doesn't recognize Muqtada, which is virulently anti-Iranian and actually burned down the Iranian consulate in Basra. I would say that most Iraqi Shiites are not eager for Iranian dominance and are Iraqi nationalists. And remember that of the million-man army that fought Iran in the 1980s, the majority were Iraqi Shiite conscripts, and they were risking their lives to keep the Iranians from taking over their country. I think that there are figures in Iraqi Shiism that are more or less willing to have a close cooperation with Iran, which see Iran as an ally, that will take money and war material from Iran. I think the Supreme Council is probably the leader in that regard, but there are apparently some members of the Sadr movement who formed what are called special groups, Majami' Khasa, which seem to get training and some weaponry from Iran as well. But I think overall it's a relatively minor part of the Shiite spectrum that's close to Iran. Most Iraqis are fairly nationalistic and want their independence. The one other thing to say is that there are Iraqi Shiite middle-class people who view Iran as a savior in an economic sense. Because, for instance, the likelihood is if things settle down in Iraq, that millions of Iranians will be coming to Iraq every year on religious pilgrimage to Najaf and Karbala, and this is billions of dollars. And so the shopkeepers in Najaf are fit to be tied, because if only things would be calm, they'd be rich now. And the Iranians are helping them to make an airport near Najaf so the pilgrims can come straight. But that kind of, cooperation and economic aspirations and so forth is not the same as accepting political dominance from them. We should go where the mic is, yes.
Thank you very much for really interesting talk. But it seems to me that the discussion right now is, well, should there be a foreign presence there or not, or should we get out? Is it even possible to get out? I mean, Time Magazine brought, like a couple of months ago, a very interesting article about just the logistics. And now in the light of American presidential elections, I mean, is it even politically possible to do anything in the next year and a half?
It's a very good question. No, I don't expect anything significant to happen in the next year and a half with regard to the U.S. troop presence. I think the escalation of 30,000, what was called the surge, it's a euphemism. It shouldn't be used. It's a troop escalation. The Republican Party doesn't want us to call it that. We should insist on calling it that. That's what it is. So I don't know. It's nice for the headline writers because there's less letters. But that escalation of 30,000 will be taken back out. In fact, 5,000 are coming out this month that were put in. And probably by July, we'll be back down to about 130,000. And I expect in January of 2009, when the new president takes the oath of office, there'll still be something on that order. So I think this president is determined to keep the troops there. I don't think there's anything anybody can do about it. But what I'm trying to argue to you today is that it doesn't seem to me to be entirely relevant to these big struggles that are going on. Because whether they're there, I mean, the fights are going to go on in Basra, the fights are going to go on around Kurdistan, and apparently the fights have been going on in Baghdad under our noses. So that the U.S. continued presence there is going to produce a settlement of these civil wars seems to me very unlikely. So, I mean, the answer is yes and no. Yes, they will stay. No, it probably won't make much difference.
Thank you also for your talk, Dr. Cole. Building off of that question, putting aside the politics, if you were put in charge of U.S. policy today, which would be a great thing, what would you do?
Well, Muqtada Sadr, the sort of fiery young cleric, established this Mahdi army in the summer of 2003, and it went on to cause a lot of trouble, and eventually got into big firefights with the Marines. And in the midst of the firefights, Muqtada went to Grand Ayatollah Sistani, the sage old man, and said, if you give the order, I'll dissolve the militia. It's causing trouble for the Shiites. And Sistani's response was, well, you didn't ask me before you founded it. Why are you asking me now? So, I mean, this situation in Iraq has gotten beyond policy. I mean, that was one of the points of my talk, is that, people sat down last year this time and planned out this troop surge, intending that it produce certain results. They didn't intend to see Baghdad ethnically cleansed of its Sunnis. I mean, the policy backfired on them. They still don't admit that that's what's happened. So any policy I sat down and made at this point is also going to backfire. And the situation is out of control. You have 3 civil wars going on. It's just unpredictable. You need somebody who's good at chaos theory. And my own experience in these things was formed in the Lebanese Civil War, where I lived in Lebanon in the early years of that war. But what I found was that people form these neighborhood militias and they fight with each other for a purpose. I mean, they're gaining something from the fighting, territory or wealth or whatever. And if you do that for a decade, the marginal improvement that you could get in your situation from further fighting gradually decreases. And ultimately, that's why the militias of Lebanon disarmed. Everybody but Hezbollah laid down their arms because they were very unlikely to get much more than they already had by continuing fighting. In fact, they were getting to the point where they were losing things. So my best guess is that the Iraqis will fight each other for a few more years, and then they'll get tired of it. That's not much of a policy, but that's my expectation. And I could be wrong, because there's two possibilities. What I'm talking about is where you fight to a stalemate. That's, I believe, what happened in Lebanon. You could fight to a conclusion, in which case there are no Sunnis in Baghdad. All the Supreme Council people in Basra are taken out and shot, and so forth. That's a longer kind of struggle, and pursuing it could last a long time. So I'm guessing they'll fight to a stalemate, but I could be wrong. They could fight to a conclusion, and if they fight to a conclusion, then it seems to me it results in the partition of the country.